Starting in 5, 4, 3. Okay, hello everyone, welcome. This is the opening of our new study, but before we get to that, I just want to say thank you. I understand we're still waiting on one member, but we're going to start relatively on time. We've done our sound checks as required, and now we're moving on. So today we have 2 designated hours. The first hour to launch our new study. The second hour will be about committee business, and let's not forget we have a different password for the committee business section. We'll talk about that. I can remind you again a little bit later, but we're all logged in, ready to go. So our study begins: challenges and issues faced by the arts, culture, heritage, and sports sectors during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have, as we usually do, start with department officials. We have with us today Madame Hélène Laurendeau, who's the Deputy Minister of the Department of Canadian Heritage. We have David Denduven, Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy and Corporate Affairs. We have Jean-Stéphane Pichet, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Cultural Affairs. And I hope I've done some justice to your names and not managed to foul things up, but I hope you will correct me in the subsequent round. Okay, just as a quick reminder to everyone, the way this works, if you're listening to us on Parleview, welcome along. But the witnesses, we have 3, will be given 5 minutes for their opening statements. Witnesses will provide the committee with the chair of the statement in advance, which they've done. Thank you. And during the questioning of witnesses, following that, there will be allocated 6 minutes, first questioner, and then each party as follows. Round 1 will have the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, we will have that. We'll get to that when we get there. In the meantime, now my experience is I question for Madame Laurendeau. 5 minutes, but is that 5 minutes just for you, or would you like to share the 5 minutes with the other witnesses as well?
I will make the opening statement on behalf of the department for all of us, and then we will be open to questions.
Okay, that being the case, merci beaucoup. That being the case, what I can do is if you go over 5 minutes, I'll be rather generous in policing that. So, for the opening statement, Madame Laurendeau, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
As for my technical problems, we will have that fixed for future appearance. J'aimerais reconnaître que nous sommes.
I would like to recognize that I'm speaking from Gatineau, Quebec, on the Anishinaabe territory and Algonquin territory. Thank the committee members for inviting us to speak about this important initiative, the COVID Emergency Fund. We are focusing on cultural, heritage, and sports sectors today, which collectively employ 750,000 Canadians and which contribute $61.9 billion annually to national GDP, and whose products, arts, books, and music and sports have provided Canadians comfort, community, and a sense of common identity during these important times. As you know, the cultural, heritage, and sports sectors were among the first to suffer widespread closures, cancellations, and associated losses due to the pandemic and public health guidelines on live venues. There was an instant shutdown because of the pandemic, and they will be among the last to return to normal operations. These sectors are already very vulnerable, and they are overwhelmingly comprised of small to medium organizations, which are heavily reliant on not-for-profit models of operations, and they sustained a lot of damage. The seasonally adjusted GDP in 2012 dollars was was $7.3 billion in July 2020 against $15.6 in February 2020, a fall of over 50% in just 4 months. The total labor force in performing arts, spectator sports, and related industries was 19.2% lower in September 2020 than it was in September 2019. The picture to date is of fragile sectors uniquely vulnerable to the effects of this pandemic. Without support, many organizations would have ceased operations already, and many are still in danger.
The government responded on April 17, 2020, when the Prime Minister announced $500 million to establish a new COVID-19 emergency support fund for cultural, heritage, and sport organizations. Very quickly after this announcement, the department went to design the fund to complement the government's existing COVID-19 support measures. And I'm referring specifically to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. The department designed this in order to make sure that gaps left by those benefits would actually be addressed. The key principles beside the emergency support funding were that the fund had to flow as quickly as possible, time was of the essence, that the process be streamlined wherever possible, and that applicants who were not normally recipients of PCH program funding be included in the disbursement of funds. The emergency support funding built on pre-existing measures, announced on March 25th to simplify the process for submitting and processing requests for 2020-2021 funding for the Canada Book Fund and the Canada Periodical Fund, which allowed eligible beneficiaries to complete applications and access financial assistance much more quickly than usual. The department also accelerated the distribution of its regular funding to eligible recipients in order to provide support quickly. Le Fonds d'urgence est entré en vigueur.
The emergency fund began in May 2020 and was dispersed in 2 phases. A first phase took advantage of existing funding mechanisms to advance approximately $307 million in temporary additional funding to recipients already benefiting from program funding via a number of departmental funding programs and from the Canada Council for the Arts and Telefilm Canada. Phase 2 funding was dispersed based on gaps identified after Phase 1. Phase 1 related to program coverage, diversity, equity, and regional distribution. And it included $45 million for special measures in support of journalism under the Canada Periodical Fund, $25 million for independent broadcasters investing in news and community broadcasts, and $52 million to arts and culture organizations that were not previously eligible for funding from Canadian heritage programs. In the distribution of this fund, the department was also highly reliant on its partners, in particular the Canada Council for the Arts, Telefilm Canada, and the Canada Media Fund, as well as Factor and Music Action, for their assistance in distributing the funds through a streamlined process that facilitated the rapid distribution of funding in a consistent manner across organizations. I would add that apart from the emergency support funding, the government supported broadcasters by flowing funding to the CRTC to enable the waiving of Part 1 license fees for the 2020-2021 fiscal year, and also earmarked $25.7 million for national museums and the National Battlefields Commission so that they could maintain their activities and allow some visits. As the ESF winds down, we are administering a survey to recipients of the Emergency Support Fund to help assess the effectiveness of the funding in terms of financial relief, employment impacts, and various social impacts. We are compiling the results of this survey. That being said, Phase 1 Emergency Support Fund recipients responded high numbers to the survey, and 77% of respondents confirmed that the fund helped them stay in operation to a large or moderate extent.
To give you an idea of the speed at which this all occurred, the Prime Minister made his announcement on April 17. Minister Guilbeault announced the launch of the program properly on May 8, 2020. Other measures that I referred to were rolled out in parallel with the Emergency Support Fund in the summer of 2020. Over 96% of the funding, which is $482 million, has been distributed by the government-wide deadline of September 30th, 2020. The remainder will be distributed by December 31st, 2020. We're talking about approximately $18 million that is left to actually distributed between us and other partners. The department is well aware that more needs to be done to support the sector during this pandemic and following this pandemic. We are currently developing policy options regarding recovery. These options will be informed by the results of a series of 22 town hall and roundtables conducted by Minister Guilbeault with stakeholders. These roundtables occur in September and October of this year, and they highlighted the vulnerable state of the sector and potential areas of acting going forward. I'd like to thank the committee. This completes my opening remarks. I hope the sound was palatable. We would be happy to actually take your question. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madame Laurando. Thank you for that presentation. Now, just before we get into it, folks, just a couple of pointers. Because our witnesses are not in the room itself, as a matter of fact, the vast majority of us are not in the room where it comes from. I just want to, just for some advice, please, if there's a specific question to a specific person, please say that person's name before you ask the question. It's sometimes can be a little awkward when we can't see who we're exactly looking at. Otherwise, I can assume, Madame Laurando, you will be probably taking the questions and refer them to your ADMs or senior ADMs, if you so please. So that being said, for 6 minutes, we're going to begin with Monsieur Blaney. 6 minutes, please. Sorry,
Alors, voilà, Monsieur le Président.
I'm here, Mr. Chair. Quebec and Newfoundland are together for the Canadian Heritage Committee. Hello. First of all, I would like to start. Yes, there's a bit of a delay with the interpretation. I would like to greet Madame Laurando. Thank you. It is a pleasure to see you again in this unusual context. I listened to your presentation and I almost want to say, well, 96% of the amount announced invested to date, well done. It's perhaps a bit like the background that behind you, that you're in a construction zone, and the Federal Public Service has risen to the challenge before it. You mentioned there were two announcements. There was one in April and then a more concrete one in May. And I asked more details from the minister at the time, and as did my colleague. And my first question would be, our concern. I see that you were able to properly support central organizations who are the normal partners of Canadian Heritage. At 2 times in your presentation, you mentioned that you sought to broaden the supports, and I would like to hear, you mentioned some amounts. I would like to hear from you, and the Jazz Festival, for example, in my riding, are a Canadian Heritage partner. They were able to count on you and they were happy for that. But there are organizations that are not necessarily in the flow chart or structure. And how did you help those organizations? And my second question, if I have time, and I'll just ask it right away, is really to know, yes, you are helping the centers of organizations, but the impact is not necessarily reaching the communities. Because of the cancellation of events, consumers aren't necessarily seeing it. How do we maintain cultural vitality and their impacts? Because sometimes there are organizations that have fundraisers. There are no funds being raised. What do you see for the future? So first of all, assistance to organizations that are outside of your normal circle of influence, and secondly, what's next? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blaney. Mr. Chair, 2 things. First of all, concerning organizations that aren't the usual organizations, the way we proceeded. First of all, it was small organizations, small museums, but there were others as well. What we did is that we very quickly, with the support of colleagues from shared services, drawing inspiration from the portal for the Emergency Relief Fund for Human Resources, we allowed people to apply under parameters, to apply in phase 2, to be able to communicate who they were and how we could reach them and discuss with them to determine the amounts they could be eligible for in phase 2 of the $500 million. We had a high success rate, I would say. We were able to reach organizations that had not received funding previously or who were not normally reached by our normal programming. Concerning other organizations and the work to be done on the relaunch, I would like Mr. Pichet to share a couple of ideas about the impact on shows and companies, both for emergency measures and also things that we're reflecting upon following the roundtable with the minister. So perhaps I could give the floor to Mr. Pichet. With your permission, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Deputy Minister, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's very relevant. As you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, the first reflex was to seek out known clientele of Canadian heritage who were already recipients of programs, because we knew from very early on in the pandemic, we made projections on the GDP for each type of cultural industry to see which would be the most affected. I'll give you some examples. We knew, for example, that performing arts would suffer incredibly. Some of those components are already part of our clientele at Canadian Heritage. So the first reflex was really to work on our known clients to ensure that the money got out the door quickly. And very quickly what we did is we identified target communities of artists, artist groups that were more vulnerable. I'll give you an example. Live music. We knew, for example, that we support music production in the department, but the performance halls for live music that wasn't a program we had before. So in phase 2, we assigned $20 million for music live music specifically rather. Among our normal clientele, we knew that many of the organizations who applied to our organizations from year to year, some of them no longer qualified. So in a second phase, we looked at those who were eligible but who hadn't met the level for funding, and we decided to give them additional support. Other examples, we did the same thing in working with Telefilm, with the CMF and the Arts Council, which all three broadened accessibility to programs to allow more groups of stakeholders to participate. So I'm just giving you a very quick overview, but there are examples in all sectors. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Just a reminder to my colleagues as well, I'm fairly strict on time, but I will be lenient with witnesses who wish to go over time, so they can complete their thoughts and their testimony. Now, Mr. Lewis, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And please thank your departments for stepping up. It's amazing to see the response from so many people in so many departments helping out Canadians. It truly was inspirational. And what I was even more proud to hear is when I heard words like, and you're talking about supporting our arts, you used the words consistent and rapid, simple, helping existing programs already, pipelines, and then helping people who weren't helped. And just maybe to add on to what Monsieur Pichet was saying, he's talking about the performing artists and how much they suffered immediately. And I can say, I'll speak from experience, because until about a year ago, almost to the day, I was a performing artist my entire life. So when artists are used to being on the downturn, first it'll be let go, last to come back from downturns. But this happened all of a sudden, and it happened at once. And these were people who usually a lot of it self-reliant, a lot of self-employed and small businesses just hustle, that gig economy itself. So I want to, my first question, well, before I even asked that, was these very artists were the ones that we turned to, that everyone turned to these artists to get us through when we were in isolation. And I know that besides my office being hit with many requests for support, my personal cell phone just exploded, because I had people who, husband and wife, work for the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony together, and now all of a sudden entire seasons are blown out, or musicians who have no place to perform. So can you explain to me just the simplicity of how much the CERB helped artists, especially in that kind of area that wouldn't normally be applied, and also the wage subsidy? I've talked to a number of small theaters and brick and mortar places who said they were able to keep their staff online. Maybe the stage is dark, but they were able to keep their staff online and look toward the future. Can you explain just how that helped the arts in general before we even get into other programs?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. That's a very important question. I will give a partial answer, and I will turn again to Monsieur Pichet for the interplay between CERB and the wage subsidy. What I should mention is that very early on, you will remember that the definition that were made for CERB was really emulating the people who were eligible for unemployment insurance, which, as you know very well, doesn't necessarily address very well the reality of people who are self-employed, as you mentioned, and particularly the gig economy. So we were very aware, very seized with that very early on, and we spent a fair amount of time explaining internally to our colleagues that it was very important that we actually either expand CERB or provide complementary measures. And I'm proud to say that we were successful on both fronts. And we made it, we wanted to be very clear that all the 500 million should not overlap or duplicate with the wage subsidy or the CERB, but be complementary for elements that would go to organization to help maintain the employment of people as much as possible. So if I was to look at two big pillars, you had the CERB and you had the wage subsidy. And on top of that, we actually designed the distribution of the 500 million to go to organizations so that they would actually have a little bit more and something more specific to their reality, particularly because they are by and large nonprofit organizations who are supporting artists that are self-employed. And the way that we did that is that we required that every applicant actually attest to the fact that the funding would not duplicate either the wage subsidy or in the case of individual, the CERB. I don't know, Jean-Stéphane, if you want to add something, since you spent a lot of time on that. And I would like to actually congratulate him because he was the mastermind behind that idea. Monsieur Pichet?
Yes, thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. The issue of flexibility was paramount. As you know, there were flexibilities introduced to CERB to allow classes of artists to have access to temporary workers were now eligible. And the wage subsidy was hugely helpful. Even the business loans were helpful. But we were very clear in our parameters that we had to be consistent with those measures and that we could not duplicate application of measures. And as the deputy mentioned, the issue of working on an attestation really fast-tracked, added flexibilities in the civil service to be able to manage this process without compromising accountability, which is always a tricky situation. But I think we have a very good story to account for. We have a record base. This is all very much a documented process, and that's really helped. And I think cultural organizations have appreciated that flexibility. We know CERB has helped a lot on the employment front. Our measures have helped maintain the structural integrity of organization as they're undertaking very, very difficult time so that they are ready when we discuss recovery issues and are ready to what we call relaunch the economy, while not forgetting that throughout this period, the creative sector has been extremely innovative in trying to provide artistic expression while the pandemic is taking place. So I think that we've acted on a multiple front, and of course we're not the only actor in that. We've had contributions from provinces, municipalities as well, who have contributed significantly also. So it's really been a joint effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can assure you the artists are ready to get out there as soon as possible. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Folks, just a quick update. Because we had some technical problems at the beginning, or technical issues, we're going to extend this meeting from 2 Eastern to 2:05 Eastern before we break to go into committee business. Monsieur Champoux, pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Champoux, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for their availability. The Department of Canadian Heritage has shown a real desire to support artists, artisans during the crisis, and we see the speed at which you establish these programs. You attributed $500 million in 2 phases, as you said, and you were able to benefit from the fact that there were already structures in place to distribute the assistance to the most affected sectors. I would like to know how you ensured that the money distributed was done so in a structured and intelligent way, and did you attach any accountability measures that allowed you to track the use of the funds distributed? Thank you very much for the question. The simple answer to your question is yes. Let me elaborate a bit. First of all, we capitalized for the first phase on our existing programs, including the The infrastructure of our existing contribution agreements, what we were able to do was ensure that all of the accountability mechanisms were maintained. Obviously, we did so. Well, it was quite simple with our partners, the large partners like Telefilm or the Canada Arts Council. But even if we accelerated the process, we still kept our transparency framework in place to ensure that the accountability would occur. We also need to know that for all of phase one, in fact, we worked with partners who we know well, who periodically review transparency. So we were able to know quite exactly what would be the cost of these applications because we knew their financial situations quite well. But we wanted to reassure, nevertheless, that we embodied transparency measures to see whether these organizations were able to access other government assistance programs. Though the same thing for the partners we knew a bit less well. We established an attestation and we made a few checks before issuing payments. And to make sure they were existing organizations that were operating in Canada. So I think under the circumstances, I can say humbly that because we benefited from existing structures and we added some measures to ensure there was no duplication, I'm quite confident that we are able to be accountable down to the smallest details. I know that you helped written media. A lot of assistance went out, and we knew that there was a fairly major crisis in place before the pandemic struck. There is, in regional media in particular, and ad revenues are a problem because local merchants can no longer pay for ads because in many cases they've closed down. We highlighted the fact that the government invested nearly $52 million in digital advertising, which without going through large firms. There was a clear desire in your department to review this. In the pandemic, have you been able to readjust to ensure that the placement of ads by the government in regional media and particularly on digital platforms is done more directly to avoid having money in the pockets of web giants rather than local media? There are a number of things that we had to put on hold during the pandemic. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. We focused on the emergency fund. Not that we've abandoned it entirely, far from that. But are we as far advanced as we would have liked? The answer is not yet. But as we're restarting our normal activities, it is something we're reflecting on. That being said, government advertising is something that is the responsibility of all departments and headed by public services and the Treasury Board. So we are continuing our reflection, but it's not Canadian Heritage alone that can resolve this complex an issue. But yes, we are continuing to reflect upon it. One last question very quickly to Ms. Laurendeau. Obviously, a study is underway to assess the needs assessed during recent months. How much time do you think you will need to assess the needs for assistance to the cultural industry? And what are the demands that you are anticipating if the funding is extended beyond the 500 million? This work is underway. I would like to reassure you, it is ongoing. As I said in my remarks, Minister Bibeau has consulted broadly. There are other options, and obviously, the control of all investments. Well, Canadian Heritage does not control all of it, but we are part of a government effort to develop a number of options on the recovery mechanisms which affect culture, heritage, but also amateur sport. We don't talk about it as much, but it is also there are also a number of measures for that. But yes, the work is ongoing. Thank you.
For 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming and sharing this information with us. It's very interesting. I'm from Edmonton, Strathcona. That's my riding, and as many of you will know, it is sort of the heart of the theatre industry in Alberta. Certainly, we are the host to the Edmonton Fringe Festival, which of course is the largest and oldest fringe festival in North America. So in addition to the roundtables that the minister did, I also did some roundtables with theater folks in my community. And I was really impressed. They're very innovative. They've used technology to produce shows, to find ways to have, smaller live audiences that are safe and follow protocol. But in every case, this was more of a way that the artists saw themselves as getting by, or reminding audiences that they still exist. It's not a solution to their financial problems, and it's not going to save these cultural organizations, of course. They're grateful for the funding that they did receive through the COVID-19 Emergency Support Fund, but the funding is not going to be enough. And as we were initially planning on this going until, maybe the fall, and now are looking at it going again into the summer, and who knows for how long, will there be another round of the emergency funding so that these theater organizations can survive? And if so, when? And if so, can you share any details about that?
Apology, I am a bit of a dummy when it comes to computers, and I don't have as much practice as you, all of you. Thank you for the question. You are actually quite right that we are in this moment where many of the emergency measures are getting to their limit, and the needs, particularly with the resurgence of wave 2, the needs remain. The dilemma right now is to determine: do we jump into the relaunch, or do we actually maintain a current type of support? I am not in a position to tell you exactly when, but I am in a position to tell you that we are looking at those two sets of options. Do we need to reconduct momentarily while we work on the relance, or do we actually have to jump and get into what would be the relaunch of the economy? One thing is clear for all of us: the impact has not resolved itself, particularly since the capacity to gather publicly remains fairly limited and will be for a fair amount of time. That being said, though, and you mentioned it, we totally agree with you. We can trust creators to be creative, and there are elements of new type of business that are emerging that actually will probably sustain the test of time and deserve to actually be looked at and supported as different or alternative to existing more traditional business model. So collectively, with the team, with David and Jean-Stéphane, we are quite aware of the fact that we're going to have to embed into these element of relaunching the economy a space for those new business models that are currently emerging. It would be disappointing to see that innovation go backwards if we were to just try to recreate the status quo. I think that the activity that we see demonstrate that there will be different alternative to arts and arts business model that will deserve our attention.
Well, and that made me bring me to my next question, and I appreciate what you're saying about innovative ways to do things, and certainly we have seen that within the museum sector as well, because they are now doing tours online and whatnot. But museums, as you know, have been very hard hit. Will the Museum Assistance Program be expanded to provide long-term funding to make sure that they can pivot to provide different types of programming, but also survive the pandemic? Particularly those that are not part of, those that are not the larger national ones?
All options are on the table. That's pretty much what I can tell you right now. I am not in a position to tell you specifically whether or not it will be a reconduction or whether or not it will be something else, but all options remain on the table. And I would add that the popularity of the Museum Assistant Program in the form that we experimented with during through the emergency funding phase 2 is something that we will actually go back to the stakeholders once we have finished distributing the fund, which we just finished, through our survey to find out what really worked and what would be of interest for the future. I mentioned that we have surveyed the recipients for phase 1, and we are currently in the process of surveying the recipients for phase 2, which would capture the bulk of the recipients of the emergency funding from the Museum Assistant Program. But you're quite right, a lot of very interesting innovation has occurred on that front that also supports to be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Okay, now into our second round. I believe he is in the room. Mr. Shields, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm assuming there's only one. This is the second round. It'll be it. Do we have time for a third round?
I suspect not, given the time constraints.
So I will split my time with Mr. Waugh.
Okay. Now, do you want 2.5 minutes each, or would you like to just hand it to him yourself?
I will do 2.5 minutes each, and I'm going to go quick then.
Very good.
All right. Deputy Minister, great to see you. I'm going to go quickly. I'm probably looking for some answers for questions that you can respond to and later. Building communities through arts and heritage. When you do further surveys and finding out what happened with this money, was it basically just kept organizations alive, like executive directors? Did it just keep the organizations alive, or where did the money go to? So in your follow-up, I hope that you could find that and be able to communicate that the goal was to keep organizations alive, but where did the money go? It'd be great to find that out. Canadian Council of Arts, led by our colleague in the last Parliament from Edmonton Centre, study done on where funds went in Canada, and this is under Heritage. So in Alberta, it was 50% less funding came into Alberta under that study that we ended. So I would like to see under this one, where did the money go by province? So I'm looking for you to be able to supply that for us. The last one, funding stream to address harms to local news productions. This has been slightly brought up by my colleague here in the room, but my print publication people say to me, if the government would spend money in the print rather than the digital, we could survive. So out of that 22.5 million, did it all go to print, or did the government spend money on social media and not print? So those 3 questions I've got for you, I'm sure you're going to have to go find them somewhere else, but I would sure love to have the answers for them. But I really appreciate you being here. You are a really good person that we have in our committees over the year, and really appreciate your contribution to this Heritage Committee. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those 3 questions. We have elements of answer, and I will, for the sake of time, I will ask Jean-Stéphane to actually cover the elements that we have at the tip of our hand, and we will undertake to actually provide you what we can based on whatever we're not able to answer right away. So with your permission, I would turn to Monsieur Pichet.
Excuse me. On the first question on BACA specifically, and in fact it applies to all programs, we had very specific eligible costs which could not derive a lot from the regular programs of the department. Which is not so much on administration, but on fixed costs that the organization needed to maintain organizations alive. We can send you the list of coverage of costs within that. We'll be more than happy to do that. On representation, we can also send you the CCA representation breakdown by province, which is information that we have. I can't attest to the decline or up, but it's around 6 or 7% of the funding from the Canada Council attributed to Alberta. I will caution on overall numbers around representation. We could have a discussion just on that, but I will endeavor to find you that information.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pichet. I have to cut it there. Mr. Wah for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the department officials coming, and I want to thank you for getting the money out as soon as you could. We still have 18 million in the next two months that you send out. The first event that was canceled was the Junos in my city in Saskatoon. March 15th, Sunday, was supposed to be the Junos, and then everything collapsed on March 13th. This city lost over $9 million because they couldn't host the Junos. How are they going to regroup this money? Because they had put in over a year and a half of organization to host the Junos, and then the rug was pulled Friday night from this event. I guess I would go to Department Minister, Deputy Minister. Yeah.
Thank you. That is a testimony to the brutality of what happened when actually the pandemic came about. The city, we do not, to be perfectly clear, we do not offset lost revenue of that nature, at least not in the current state. Are we taking into consideration not recovering costs that we had provided for various activity? We are, but the department does not directly fund the Junos per se. So that would not be captured in what we would be able to offset. I don't know, Jean-Stéphane, you know that system a bit better than me. Is there anything else you want to add on that? But what you're describing is true of other activities that happen and the brutality of the impact that was felt all across the art and sector and live music and other endeavor of that nature. I would also say that there were also sports events that actually had the same impact or similar impact. Particularly events that were in preparation for the Olympic that didn't happen. But we don't have a contribution agreement to actually offset that at this stage. Jean-Stéphane, do you want to add something very briefly because time is of the essence?
Yes, thank you. It's absolutely tragic what has happened. Many festivals, many events, cultural events were canceled. There's been revenue loss across the board. That is why a fund like the Music Fund, which is the regular fund's $36 million, was advanced early in the pandemic to help organization and the industry itself find ways to address some of those issues. In ESF, the emergency funds, there were $32.6 million given to the Music Fund, including studios, including also the live music environment, which as a group have at least helped maintain that industry going. This is not going to replace the loss for that event that was supposed to take place in your city, but we're trying to find ways to compensate through the support we give to the industry.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Madame Bessette, for 5 minutes, please.
Merci de votre présence.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for your testimony to the witnesses. I am a sporty person, and I know how important it is to be active. I participated in the Olympics, and I know that there are many Canadians who participate in high-level events. With the pandemic, these events were cancelled, and despite this situation, which is out of our control, a number of organizations have shown some innovation. There are hundreds of communities across Canada. In my riding of Brome-Missisquoi, the sport community innovated. A 4-star Olympic committee was created to following health measures, and the event was held from coast to coast, and it was broadcast with social distancing measures. My first question to Ms. Laurando: couldn't this event could not have been held without the support of the government? Were the Olympic athletes affected, and how are you supporting them? Thank you, Madame Bissett. You raise a very important point. And my colleague will get some numbers for you while I answer. We captured. Our emergency fund was designed to do the same thing for amateur sport as for what was done for culture and heritage. The emergency fund, which gave a certain percentage to organizations, we also gave to sports organizations through our normal mechanisms with normal partners, whether it's federations or they work with the provinces to distribute monies. We also increased the Athletes Support Fund because, as you mentioned so well, the work for Olympic athletes is a life's work, and the culmination is the Olympics. And the pandemic hit when these athletes were hitting their maximum. So we have like a double cohort, and we couldn't start sharing them by saying the ones who missed the Olympics will continue, and others were trying to reach that level at the same time. So that's why we increased funding to support our athletes, to take into account the constraints that have been added because of the pandemic. I would also say that concerning amateur sport, we ensured that we were maintaining funding, and we need to ensure the sustainability of these organizations so that everyone can continue what they're doing. I don't know, David, whether you were able to get total funding for athlete support. In the meantime, perhaps, I'd just like to ask another short question because my time is short. I had 4 questions, but I'll go to the last one because it's something that's important to me. The World Anti-Doping Organization is an international organization responsible for anti-doping. And if you look at the code, which was updated in 2020, and the new code will enter into effect January 1st, 2021, will the current pandemic slow the implementation of the policies by the Canada Council for Ethics in Sport? I'll have to get back to you in writing because off the top of my head I can't say. I don't believe so, but I don't want to mislead you, so I will send I'll send the committee the response in writing. And Mr. Chair, if you would allow me, I would say that the amount that we gave to sport was $72 million to, as the Deputy Minister noted, to support athletes, but also sports organizations across the country, including the Canadian Olympic Committee, for the costs that they assumed due to the delay in the Olympics. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, merci. And pour la prochaine question.
For the next question, Mr. Champoux, for 2 minutes 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2008, after the economic crisis, there was a program that was struck, the tourism program that gave a boost to the tourism industry to get out of after the crisis because of economic problems that it was experiencing. This is a similar financial situation, even worse, and it's a program that the industry greatly appreciated at the time. A number of people would be happy to see a similar program once again. Is this a program that you would consider to stimulate the tourism industry and the festival industry that would correspond to what that program targeted back in the day? I would say that a variation of this is currently being considered. It falls under our colleagues at Industry and Tourism. However, the connection of the impact on festivals, cultural festivals, or on sports events, well, there's the impact, as your colleague mentioned. It has an impact on the tourism industry and on local activities. So when I said earlier all options are on the table, obviously we are looking at things that were done in the past to see if they're possible to tailor to the future. I can't say whether it will be launched or not, but it's certainly something that's being considered. Quick question concerning assistance that will be redesigned based on the data that you're collecting. Do you have the intention to ensure that at the end of the line that artists, creators, artisans, freelancers that depend on contracts, do you have a mechanism to ensure that those people will be really assisted and that they receive the support that they need? I would say that it's a constant concern. It's what's moved us since the very beginning of the pandemic and mobilized our colleagues in other departments because it requires tailored measures for arts and culture sector, just for the reasons that you mentioned. So the simple answer to your question is yes, it is a concern. The way we will achieve this, will it be a combination of transparency of organizations or direct funding? It remains to be seen, but it is definitely one of our key considerations. Thank you very much.
Merci. Ms. McPherson, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did want to just follow up a little bit on what my colleague from the block has just brought up. Edmonton Strathcona, of course, is home to a number of festivals, and the Fringe Festival is one of them, but we also have the Heritage Festival, the Street Performance Festival, Art Folks, all of these things that weren't able to go forward, and all of these things that have deep impacts across the community in terms of restaurants and shops and all kinds of things. Now, I know that you've given us some information about that, and I appreciate that, but I would just press very hard that these festivals are so vital for so much economic and cultural response in our communities. But one of the questions I did want to ask really quickly is in terms of venues. So we have a large number of performance venues that are both for profit and nonprofit, and because there were a number of issues with the CECRA, with the rent program, many of those venues weren't able to access it and actually did have to close. So we've now heard that others that have been hanging on, just trying to get through until spring, are now worried that they are on the verge of shutting down forever. So can you talk about how you are planning to help venues with the current restrictions? We're asking them to stay closed for safety reasons. How can we make sure that they're protected?
For the sake of time, I will jump right away to Monsieur Pichet on this one. Monsieur Pichet?
Thank you for the question. There is no silver bullet on that question. What we do find out, and we're sharing information with the Canada Council as well as our own program, the Arts Presentation Fund, to look at organizations that own venues versus those who occupy other buildings. And of course, those who own venues have suffered way more, because covering all the cost of and not being able to operate have suffered way more. So the impacts of our emergency funding has been uneven from that perspective, because those who actually own venues have suffered a lot more. And as you mentioned, the rent program has had some issues as well. It is also a discussion in terms of what are the ingredients you need for restart and how we're going to do this. So it's a discussion in terms of what do we need to maintain while the closures are going on to maintain the infrastructure? And the other part of the answer is in the stimulus component. What do we need, and what kind of infrastructure that we need, and how do we build in the adaptation component within those if we have a pandemic that lasts longer than we have, and we can do a form of reentry, and how can we adapt, build some adaptation features and infrastructures to be able to make those organizations more resilient to issues such as the ones we've lived through right now.
Thank you, Mr. Pichet, and thank you, Ms. McPherson, and of course to everybody. I want to thank specifically Madame Laurando, Mr. Denduven, and of course Monsieur Pichet for coming in today on this wide topic, big topic to grapple with in just 1 hour. But nevertheless, we do appreciate you coming in, providing the answers, and of course, I'm sure you'll follow up in cases where you mentioned that you would, and we appreciate that. So, thank you. Committee members, we're going to break to go into camera, and there is a technical process of doing such, and that may take some time. I'm going to ask Tom to come on, the clerk Tom, to when we break, when do we get notified to come back? How does that work?
Certainly. Thank you, sir. So we'll ask the members to log out of this meeting, the ones obviously that are logged into Zoom, log out of this meeting. It should take only a few minutes to get the next meeting set up, but perhaps give us a minute or two just for the clerks to log in, and then please do follow the instructions you've received by email to log into the second meeting. Perhaps just a moment or two after you log out of this meeting, we should be set up relatively quickly, and then we'll get to the testing and all that once we're in that meeting.
Okay, so we can log in after we log out from here, and of course that requires a second password, as you know. So that being said, let's now suspend.
Apologies,
and
sir.
We'll
can I just chime in? I'm being told actually by IT if members can wait maybe 5 minutes before logging in. Is that
okay?
Okay.
So it is now. I'm doing the translation. It is now 2:07 there. How about at 2:50? Okay, there you go. I can't even add, for goodness sake. How about at 2:12 we log back on? Okay, everyone, let's suspend. you.